Can I welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. Our main item today is a discussion with invited guests on affordable home ownership. Members of the public can follow the meeting on the webcast and on Twitter using hashtag Assembly Housing and hashtag Shared Ownership. Please may I remind members, guests and the audience to turn their phones off or to put them on silent. Can I ask the clerk if any apologies have been received?
Yes, apologies have been received from Assembly Member Curtin.
Thank you. Can I ask members to note the list of officers on the report and ask if they have any additional interest to declare? No. Can we agree the minutes from the previous meeting held on the 3rd of September 2019?
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask members to note the completed, outstanding and closed actions arising from previous meetings? Yes, thank you. And that brings us to today's main item, a discussion with invited guests on affordable home ownership. So can I welcome our guests, Steve Mosley, who's Group Director of Governance Strategy and Communications at London Quadrant Housing Trust, Reuben Young, who is the Director of Price Out, Peter Apps, News Editor at Inside Housing, Councillor Danny Beals from Camden Council, and Dr. Alison Wallace, Research Fellow at the University of York. So thank you all very much for joining us this morning. So I'm going to kick off, and my first question is to Reuben, first of all. And that's, what is your opinion on whether shared ownership is truly affordable for people on low and middle incomes in London?
Affordable is an interesting word because everything is affordable to someone. Affordable means a lot of things in housing. It means affordable to the buyers who purchase it, but the affordable word that I'm interested in is the affordable that means it gets public subsidy. So government money goes towards subsidising the cost of shared ownership homes, and it goes to a bracket of earners who are not in housing need so much as housing desire. And it's a good product for them, and it satisfies housing aspiration, which is a good thing. But where it diverts funding away from low rent homes for people in genuine housing need, I think that's a big problem.
Okay, thank you. Can I bring in our other guests on the subject of whether or not you think shared ownership is affordable? Alison.
Yeah, I did a recent piece of work about shared ownership markets outside London, but that included a sort of quantitative assessment of like core and the family resources survey, and found that the new entrants in London were in income quintiles, the top two income groups. Where in other places that wasn't the case. There were more low and moderate income households, so we're actually meeting the needs of quite a more affluent group of people than in other places. Obviously that's at high housing costs as opposed to low incomes necessarily in as it was in some areas, but I think that is that's a sort of a political decision about if you want to fund those people, as Reuben said. There was other issues as well about whether it's affordable. 32% of shared owners in London said the housing costs were a burden, compared to 45% of renters and 24% of mortgages, so it's half rent, half mortgage, and that was the same proportion as in the north, but as I was saying, that's a sort of function of low incomes rather than high housing costs. And I think there's a whose needs it's meeting is, you could see from the sort of several research projects that I've done that you're seeing people buy, like with careers in zones 1 and 2, so they're on a professional career trajectory compared to people in the outer boroughs and the other bits of the south east and east who are on in jobs. You know, that is their job and that's the level they'll be. And again, and they're finding it a more difficult sort of thing to sustain.
Okay, thank you. Danny.
Yes, just to echo Reuben's point, obviously affordable to someone, yes, but is it really where particularly the levers we have as actors of the state, should be directing our attention. So here with two hats, both planning authority, so we have levers through the planning system to deliver intermediate and shared ownership housing, and also direct delivery. So Camden has its own investment programme building 3,000 homes, of which there are about 300 to 500 that are planned to be intermediate. We introduced an intermediate housing strategy in 2006, recognising that although we initially planned to deliver that intermediate housing as shared ownership, it was becoming quite obvious that that wasn't hitting a group of people who perhaps need the support most. That group of people who won't qualify for the social rent housing we're building, but increasingly being squeezed out of boroughs like Camden. And this may be particularly in a London perspective, but I think as the housing market changes, as prices increase across London, it's going to be increasingly a London-wide perspective. Average house prices in Camden, somewhere between £750,000 for a reasonable small property. A shared ownership approach to that sort of value of property, you need an income. I think we were finding example in Fitzrovia, average market value units of shared ownership of £902,000. The incomes of those accessing those properties was in excess of 50,000, and they had £54,000 of equity to put in it. I mean, for us, this wasn't the particular group who were the priority for us in terms of public subsidy and support. So our intermediate housing strategy shifted our approach away from shared ownership to an intermediate living rent, as we call it, product, Camden Living. We set up a wholly owned company for our direct delivery, but also expect the private sector to also deliver intermediate rent going forward, not shared ownership.
Could you tell us how your Camden Living Rent differs from, say, the Mayor's London Living Rent?
There's no staircasing or shift to owning any part of the property in future. It's a 3-year renewable tenancy. It's set at a proportion of income. It's very reasonable. I think the target group for the product is a household income of £30,000 to £40,000, so very reasonable. And so far, so we've directly delivered almost 70, and the results are quite positive of that on 2 schemes. So 63% work in public sector or social value roles, as we call it. 36 health workers, 12 education workers, including 7 teachers, 4 police officers, and a quarter sons and daughters who've moved from council estates. So our estimate is that it is a product that is working for the group of people who would not qualify for social housing, but will increasingly find it difficult to live in Camden. I think one of the challenges we find, both in discussing it with the private sector and also ourselves in delivering it, is the subsidy system doesn't perhaps incentivise it as much as it could. The grant available for intermediate housing is flat, no matter how affordable it is or what type of product it is. And as a builder, there's an incentive to deliver shared ownership sometimes, because you immediately can extract capital receipt back into your programme and back into reinvestment, and that isn't the case for this sort of product. But our feeling is it's working for that squeeze, the squeezed Londoners who our public institutions and our private institutions are saying are really struggling to be able to live and work in central London.
In terms of the unaffordability of shared ownership, is the issue, in your view, that people can't afford the staircase, or people can't afford the initial stake to begin with, or both?
So I think in Camden it's also that former point as well. I think it's just so much the value. I think a 25%, even sometimes a 10% stake in a property is a lot for lower and middle income groups on average incomes. As I said, people accessing these properties, the evidence suggests in Camden, are earning 50, 60, 70,000 pounds. That's not an average income by any means. And I think, as the other speaker mentioned, there are clearly some long-held issues for those in shared ownership of the ability to move, the ability to staircase effectively, hidden costs and charges that aren't always obvious, and service charges. So I think there are also problems with the product itself. But I think our primary concern in Camden was that first question of, is this genuinely an affordable product? Is this the priority for the public sector? And I think we answered no on those things.
Thank you. Senator Berry, did you want to come in specifically on Camden?
Just because obviously I'm declaring an interest, which is my interest normally. I'm a Camden councillor, so I know quite a lot about Camden's policies. And obviously, Danny, you're the cabinet member for planning and the cabinet member who who works on the delivery from Camden, and you've got policies in both areas. I'm not sure that we've quite drawn out the distinction there. That you've got a planning policy that's against shared ownership, and also your own delivery choices are different. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about how whether you've succeeded in reducing the amount of shared ownership in planning applications through your policy.
Yeah, so that's right, Sean, thank you. So the intermediate housing strategy is a broader policy that applies through our approach to planning. We, as I said, in discussions with developers going forward, are very clear that our view is that shared ownership is not an affordable product in Camden. We want an intermediate rented product, ideally in line with our Camden living rent bands and rates. Obviously, there is always discussion in terms of viability of schemes, and those rates may vary, and the rented product may vary, but that is our preference. And we have actually successfully defended this at appeal. So a housing association, unfortunately, I won't name them because they have changed their approach since, decided not to proceed with that advice, proceeded with a very low affordable percentage on their scheme below policy, but also shared ownership despite our policy. And we went to appeal, and the Inspectorate clearly said, Camden has a policy, it's evidence-based, this product isn't affordable, and their appeal was dismissed. And since then, we haven't had any issues either with that association or any other in Camden, which is really pleasing. So I think the facts are there, and the inspector could see the logic of the policy. It was based on evidence, and it had been delivered by Camden in practice. So it was hard to argue against. And I think there are some legacy schemes, so schemes that had planning permission prior to the policy that work through the system for various. It can take a long time to work a scheme through the system. But what we're actually doing is proactively engaging with those schemes and negotiating with them after planning permission, and have been successful in, albeit not switching all shared ownership to rent, but some, and we also have the ability to offer additional affordable housing funding to enable that as well.
Thank you. Nikki, sorry, did you have a point as well?
Well, just, I think some of the questions about affordability have been really answered, but my understanding is correctly then that you're doing much more London living rent than you're doing shared ownership?
So it's a living rent product. It's a slightly different living rent product in that everyone likes to sort of have their own brand, but Camden living rent. So my understanding is it's below London living rent rental values.
Okay. And so if well, just another thing. So what happens to families in Camden in terms of either shared ownership or intermediate, any kind of intermediate? I mean, are you providing family housing?
So it's a real challenge in Camden. We've got, I think, the lowest birth rate in London. We have decreasing pupil numbers. It's a real challenge for our schools at the moment. And that we feel is driven largely by the housing market, but there are other factors. We are prioritising delivering social rent properties first, and those properties are largely family units. We then prioritise intermediate rent units, and again, would prioritise family-sized units. Like anything in a scheme, there'll be a unit mix. I think our priority order goes in that process. So the distribution of family units on a scheme would ideally be first through the social units, then for the intermediate units, then the private units last. So the private units normally are studios and one beds, some twos.
I get it. Okay, and just in terms of the intermediate products that you're offering, do they convert into home ownership at some point?
No, they're a 3-year tenancy that's renewable. It's purely a rented product, and they're renewable if the families are still meeting the criteria, which is living or working in Camden, and ideally earning around £30,000 to £40,000 household income.
Right. So there aren't routes to. I mean, what are the routes to affordable home ownership in Camden, if any?
Well, I think it's a challenge, isn't it? We made the judgment that shared ownership or subsidised market sale, whilst yes, it's a route to home ownership, it clearly wasn't a route to home ownership for lower or even middle income families. Our question was whether those people who are earning £50,000, £60,000, £70,000, who had £50,000 of equity, really needed Camden to subsidise them above all other families, our judgment was no, that there are other routes in London and in Camden to a safe and secure and affordable home for those families. It's a difficult decision. Ideally, we would like to be able to offer a broader mix, but the limits we have in terms of national funding, of grant funding, mean we do have to make priorities.
Understand, yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'll finish this point off around whether or not shared ownership is affordable. I'll come to Pete first, and then Steve to finish off.
Just to, for any of the panel members that don't know, I think probably the main reason I was invited today, apart from working at Inside Housing, is that I'm a shared owner myself. I bought a property in December 2018. And just like just to add to what the other panellists have said, just a couple of brief observations. In my experience of searching for a home, confirmed the kind of long-held view I think there's been in the sector about shared ownership, that it is still affordable for people on reasonable incomes in outer London boroughs, but it's quite unaffordable in inner London boroughs. Certainly that was the case for us when we were looking for a place, and we probably fall into the middle range of the salary banding. I don't think that's reflected in new build strategies. A lot of the properties that were coming on stream were being built still in areas that I don't think would be affordable to shared ownership buyers, and I'm not entirely sure why that's the case. It strikes me that the sector's known for a long time that building shared ownership in Zone 1 and 2 isn't going to hit the target market, but they still seem to be doing it. And I was also frustrated on a number of schemes that they had baked-in service charges that took schemes that would have been affordable into an unaffordable bracket. So, for example, by including concierge services or other amenities, which I think were there to make the schemes more attractive as private sale options, there was a monthly set service charge that took it completely out of our reach, and I think would do for a number of other shared owners as well. And the last point I'd suggest the panel might have a look at some research we did as Inside Housing back in 2014 into the amounts of money people were putting down as deposits for shared ownership, because I think the only way that sales are secured in boroughs like Westminster with a salary band of £90,000 is to put an enormous chunk of equity in to reduce the mortgage. And I mean, we found evidence of people putting up to £150,000 cash in order to buy the shared ownership property. And so someone might be in a bracket that you want to help on their salary, but absolutely not in terms of the amount of equity they can put in. And so I think there's probably quite a lot of shared ownership sales going through, which are being achieved through a large cash sum at the start. Because if you can only get a mortgage to 4.5 times your income, how you can buy 50% on £1 million shared ownership home beats me. So I think those are some things which sometimes are a little bit under-discussed in the affordability debate.
Thank you. And finally, coming to you, Steve, and perhaps in particular you could address this inner outer London point and whether or not providers should be building shared ownership in zones 1 and 2 now.
So I think my views reflect a number of the panel have expressed. It is affordable to a very particular group. That is a middle income group. It's not low income group. I'll start with the experience, L&Q's experience so far. So last year, the average single purchaser buying a shared ownership home, one of our homes was on 35k, which is around about the middle income of Londoners. For households, it was 50k. We were seeing deposit levels around a fifth of the level that you would see from first-time buyers, not with assistance entering the market. And obviously, first-time buyers and the GLA's data supports this are substantially higher than those levels that we're seeing. So I think it absolutely operates as space, but it operates as space between those who can afford can buy outright, and in the middle it is sort of a good middle income in London. Our figures in part reflect where we work. So we tend to work generally outside of zones 1 and 2. The average sale price of a shared ownership home that L&Q delivered last year was 430,000. So that's clearly not in the same sort of benchmark of those figures that we've talked about. So I think there are some genuine there are some genuine challenges. We ask ourselves that question when we're delivering shared ownership, whether it works in locations. On some locations, we don't provide it if we don't think that it can stack up and it's reasonable. I think it also does come back to Councillor Beale's point around the funding. So the funding is flat and fixed. It is a pretty low level, to be honest, for the type of product being delivered. So £28,000 in grant funding is not going to kind of deliver a proposition in very high value areas. I think that is going to be, you could genuinely stand back and say is affordable. So I think that's a question. As London as a whole, it is helping households within that sort of 25k to 50k barrier, which I would say sort of is middle income, so it is performing a role at the moment. But we have seen over the past few years, even though our deposits are substantially less than the market, we have seen them increase significantly as house prices have increased.
And do you think, therefore, potentially in future funding settlements with the GLA, that perhaps there should be a policy of not funding shared ownership in most of zones 1 and 2? Do you think that should be an explicit policy if it's not really delivering affordable housing?
I think possibly it would need to be looked at in the round on whether you could, for example, give a greater level of funding to reduce the shared ownership unsold equity rent requirement that makes it affordable. But clearly that's got to be a judgment. If we're delivering home ownership in that, it's got to meet that target market. And if we're pushing at the edges of it, sometimes we do go to higher incomes, but they tend to be for the larger homes that we're delivering. If it's a larger family home, I think there's more of an argument around that you could do that. So rather than kind of a blanket, it shouldn't be in those areas. I think it's perhaps a bit, a more nuanced view around, is there something in policy terms that can be done to make sure that it is affordable when it's delivered in those areas?
And are you finding, when it comes to resales, for example, even if it was affordable when it was first built, that by the time someone comes to sell, if the value has gone up significantly in that area, they're struggling to find anybody who can then afford to buy the property who's within that 90k household income?
We haven't found that today. I think we've got there's quite an active secondary market in shared ownership, so people don't have problems selling their homes. They can sell the share, and people are quite happy to buy a share in a home. So there's certainly no evidence from us that we've got properties that are sticking through that. Our average time to sell a shared ownership property when it comes to us is 5 weeks, which is substantially quicker than it would be on the private market. So it's not something we're seeing at the moment. I accept that if you've got a lot of those very high value properties, it might be a challenge going forward in the future.
Okay, thank you. I want to just turn now to the issue of whether or not shared ownership is effective at bringing people into full ownership, and I want to come to you, Alison, for this. So how effective do you think it is at actually getting people into full ownership? I mean, what proportion of people actually end up buying the full property in the end?
Well, there's been, the data is lacking to answer that question easily, and has been for a long time, unfortunately. But all the evidence that has sort of been attempted so far points to quite a low rate, sort of 4, 7, 11 different sort of figures have been put on this in the past. But I think the issue of staircasing is hugely important, and I think one of the reasons it's really important is actually in the sales material. It's from all the interviews I've done, which is like probably adds up to quite a few hundred shared owners, as it's hugely important in their appetite to buy, because the promise of full ownership hangs over the purchase. But there's obviously multiple barriers to staircasing that I've identified in a few things. And the first one, especially in London, is house prices rise faster than incomes and people never catch up. And that's particularly an issue, again, if people aren't on a professional career path and house prices run away with them. The way people do staircase is that they become a couple. London's got the highest rate of single purchasers, so I think that's also an issue, because in other places it's taking 2 salaries to buy, and in London, because people are on some higher incomes, they are buying alone. But obviously you can't make people partner as a policy response, but the other way people move and become homeowners is they have got access to move into a cheaper area, and that fits into a pattern of population turnover within London anyway, that people might come in their 20s and move out to the suburbs or the southeast anyway. So that is an option there for London shared owners. And the other option, as people said, is through inheritance, that they might be able to plug that gap between their wages and house prices. But there's also administrative barriers. So a lot of housing associations charge you £200, £175, whatever the charge is for your valuation, before you even have any idea about what price your house is, how much your mortgage is, what the impact will be on your rent, for example. So you're having to pay an upfront cost before you even know the rudimentary things about what the next step might be. And some
we're going to be coming on to the issue of fees later.
Right,
in
some
the
housing
meeting,
associations,
yes.
yeah, okay, well, some housing associations pay those things. But I think ways to get over that is like staircasing calculators. I'm sure it's not beyond anyone to just do an Excel spreadsheet that people can plug in their rent and mortgage costs and house values. And there's also automated valuations of, that are also becoming more prevalent, that might be used. But also people have mentioned about there's a nervousness about higher shares may deter resales. But also that people might actually decide, because it's less cost to them, is actually pay down their mortgage to increase their equity rather than buy an additional share.
I've actually got some friends who've just bought shared ownership, and they were advised not to go over 50% because they'd find it difficult to then sell.
Yeah, whether that's
unless they were going to 100%, either go to 100% or don't go over 50%.
Yeah, exactly. And whether that's evidenced in the resales, I know there are mechanisms that the housing associations could buy back a bit of the share to offer it at a lower rate, but then they have to have capital not allocated for that. But the point I also wanted to make about staircasing and affordability is that we've got people coming into is the terms on which shared ownership is being made affordable for people. And as with other first-time buyers, there's a preponderance now of 35-year mortgages. So we're in not only the low interest rate and pretty stagnant wages until recently have meant that the cost burden of home ownership lasts for a lot longer than it did certainly when I bought, where your wages and prices went up much quicker. Now that burden lasts longer, and we're actually adding another 10 years onto younger cohorts' mortgages. So that scope there to either to take out additional loans later in their journey of home ownership has already been used. That joker, as it were, has already been used to make the initial purchase affordable, let alone later purchases. And I think that's quite an important thing too. And that could affect pensions as well as saving for staircasing.
Do you think the GLA should collect data on staircasing? Because we don't at the moment.
Yeah, I do, definitely. There should be greater resources put into shared ownership data. It's been a cry for decades, really, and government haven't addressed it either.
Steve, could you tell us what sort of proportion of your shared owners end up staircasing to 100%?
Yeah, okay. So certainly back to the point about the data, there is no sort of universal data around this, although it's something that the National Housing Federation are actively looking at the moment, try and get better data on it. Staircasing rates vary. Based on last year's data, around 8% of our owners staircased in that year.
To 100%.
To 100.
So, well, of those, 60% staircase to 100%.
Right.
The rest was sort of
60%
part
of
staircasing. So that's a yearly figure. It has generally over the past 5 years been running at about 6 or 7% of shared owners staircasing every single year. So there is a sort of, we're seeing a healthy level of staircasing coming through. I think mortgage availability has got a key part in that. It is affordable to staircase at the moment. If people do it, they are most likely to do it in one step. If people will staircase, they will also likely to do it between the average year is around year 10 in the property. Very few people do it before year 4. So it is an active market at the moment. I think that pattern, speaking to colleagues across London, is repeated, that we're seeing that. It fluctuates with people's confidence in the housing market. So even though it's cheaper to staircase when prices are going down, generally people staircase when prices are going up, and so it's a reflection of the market, and certainly the low lending regime. When we had the market crash, it would probably drop down to about 2% for that yearly rate. So we've got that sort of churn of people who are buying, and then other people who are just selling their share out at that stage. But yes, I agree. Some sort of more data on that would be useful. Also, possibly something we'll touch on later. I think one of the key challenges is clearly the transaction costs around it. Some of those are the basis of the funding agreements that we have that are set out with Homes England. So they are effectively part of the funding guidance that determine the way in which we would assess that and have to have a RICS valuation. It's an area that the government is looking at in their consultation at the moment. I think we kind of fully support that. It is a choice. We do have plenty of share owners with us who are happy to maintain their equity share. I think kind of as Alison described, at a time in their life when perhaps they're living in a 1-2 bed property and they're happy to sell that share and move further out at different times. So it is all down to personal choice. We certainly present it as something that we would like to make it as easy as possible, but it's not the be all and end all. If people choose not to staircase, then that is very much a choice for them.
Would anyone else like to comment on staircasing? Any burning issue? Yeah.
It's just a sort of tangent point, really, if you indulge me. But I think, again, we have to ask, if the ultimate aim is for people to staircase to 100% and to own the property outright, I think fundamentally we see that property no longer being affordable in perpetuity. It's returned to the market and value, and it's their asset, and it's then transferred at market value on and on and on. I think that, again, is one of the challenges is we see with shared ownership. If it truly is a vehicle for people to fully staircase, to own the property outright, it enables potentially one person to access an affordable product, but then no more to the system. And again, in a very limited system with very limited grant, is that the best use of public grant to subsidise one group of people for one period of time?
Can I just come back on that point? So just in terms of staircase, it's important to say that whenever anybody does, the grant is always recycled back, and there are rules around that, how that is used. So, for example, since 2017, L&Q have used £10 million of recycled grant from staircasing into further affordable housing. So it is never lost, it is cycled back into the system.
Okay.
Just one more point on how shared ownership is an access to real ownership. The staircasing numbers are pretty low. The way people access home ownership from shared ownership is they wait for the share of their property to rise in value, and then, exactly as the other panellists said, they use that equity to then move to a bigger house somewhere else. This is predicated on rising house prices. In England, in the UK, we are still addicted to rising house prices, and shared ownership is symptomatic of that completely.
Thank you.
Very, very brief point. If I wanted to staircase right now, the chief barrier would be the fact that I can't borrow any more money, because I took, as Alison said, a 35-year mortgage, which was as much as the bank were willing to lend me, and so to get a higher mortgage, I need to go back to the bank. I need a big pay rise from Inside Housing if I'm going to do that. So. But yeah, I mean, if you've taken your maximum capacity in terms of mortgage to buy the place, I don't see how you can be expected to staircase up anytime soon.
And finally, just we mentioned collecting data, but is there anything else the mayor can do around staircasing that would help? Any thoughts on that? Steve?
Just to say that there has been a consultation at the end of last year. The government is taking forward proposals around that and is looking at it seriously. So clearly there's work already in train around that, including looking at there are other models out there. Another provider uses a model where they allow staircasing in increments of 1% each year. So Metropolitan Thames Valley have created a model that allows them to do that. So I think that is the route to increasing staircasing.
But specifically, can the mayor do anything about encouraging the data collection? Because we've heard a general criticism of the data collection.
Well, I think around, you could make it a requirement around it. I mean, we all hold it, but we all hold it individually. And so, we are funded by the mayor to deliver programmes, and if that was an outcome of it, we provide data, central collection data on average share purchase and every other element of it. There isn't a current requirement to provide it after post-sale. So if there was, I think we'd be quite happy to support that.
You wouldn't get upset by being asked.
It's the questions you're asking, the same questions that our board would be asking us as a registered provider. So absolutely not.
Brilliant. Yes, Danny.
The government's consultation has been touched upon, reducing the initial stakes to 10% and then the bands of staircasing to a minimum of 1%. I don't think there's a clear proposal of how we're going to get to a system of fair transaction fees that generally make that a practical solution to most lower income people. So obviously it's not directly within the mayor's gift or the GLA's gift, but I think making representations that if that is a model that's going to be adopted, we do have to have a fair fees and charges approach that actively matches cost of enabling staircasing.
We've got some questions coming up later in the meeting on specifically on the government's proposals. I think I'll move us on there. So we have strayed over into some of the other questions, but Andrew, you're coming in next.
Okay. Is anybody able to outline in a nice, easy way what the legal status of a shared owner is? I mean, are they actual owners? Are they subject to eviction and loss of their investment? And if, for example, they don't pay rent. So, Dr. Watts.
Yeah, that shared ownership is a landlord-tenant relationship, and it's a leasehold, and what you've purchased isn't a property. What you've purchased is permission to occupy that property for a certain amount of time, and as such, it's inherent in shared ownership, especially for flats, all the weaknesses of the leasehold tenure, which is subject to huge attention at the moment. But I think there's lots of issues with well, on terms of repossession that you mentioned, I think that is at odds as well, because you could use ground date to repossess, although some housing associations don't use it, and there's agreements with the lenders in terms of the mechanisms that will go through for housing associations to take back the properties. But increasingly we'll see shared owners without mortgages. There's a lot of people entering shared ownership after relationship breakdown, taking equity sums and then to pay the purchase bit and then just paying the rent. So I think the issue where people's equity is at risk through the Midland Hart Richardson court case is still really unresolved there. And I think it's an anomaly that lenders have to go through. If it's ownership, then lenders have to go through discretionary processes. But the power is still there for housing associations to go through mandatory routes to possession. But I think there's also issues about the legalities, but how that is actually lived. And that through our research, the actual ability, because how shared ownership has been constructed as a home ownership product and sold as such. At one time, I think they've moved away from it now, I sense, but at one time there was a lot of things that said in marketing, like it's literally just like home ownership, which I think is a bit lazy copy. But it's not, because it's not literally the same. But I think the people's ability to be able to call themselves homeowners is hugely powerful on people, because you do, and it's not entirely, although there are problems with it, there's not entirely no substance to it, because people have more control and autonomy, particularly if they're in a house rather than a flat. And all those things that we associate with home ownership. But on the last point, on the legalities, I think there's an issue of how the house, from the development stage to how it becomes the shared ownership product. There's lots of different stages of legal processes that the properties go through, from how the head lease is constructed and passed to the association, rights with the management companies. And the housing associations have a whole heap of different leases with different structures about whether shared ownership, shared owners in blocks are able to control, have rights to the management company and voting rights and things like that over how their home is controlled, that I think housing associations could do a lot more to iron out at the actual design stage, to ensure that shared owners are included in the block management and have rights to attend. Sometimes the housing association is just counted as one member per vote, and it's not shared out between the other shared owners, so they're sort of written out of a formal say over how their home is controlled.
So I'm not going to impinge on the next question, which is closely in that my colleagues are going to ask in the same sort of area, but is it fair, therefore, to call, we're using the term shared ownership. Is that an accurate term to describe what we're talking about?
Well, it's a landlord-tenant relationship, but then so is leasehold. And if you just bought an open market flat, then we as a society would call that ownership. But as I said, you're not owning the property, you're owning permission to live in that property for a fixed period of time, which is different to freehold ownership. So we have a problem in England and Wales with our structure of land ownership. That could be resolved with common hold, but it didn't take off. But whether that there's, with all the investigation of leasehold, and maybe there could be more effort on part of housing associations to explore whether they could offer it as common hold. I don't know what the legalities of that are, but we did look at the lease and everything when we did our research. I did it with 2 professors from law schools.
Thank you. Anybody else coming on that?
Okay, in that case, well, Nikki's got a sort of similar question, so I'll hand over to Nikki now.
Leads on from that, really. Perhaps ask Peter Abbs. Then we've just been hearing about how it isn't really ownership. Do you think then it's misleading to market these shared ownership as home ownership? And wouldn't it be better perhaps to market them as an assured tenancy?
I suppose it depends what you mean by better. I know that the Advertising Standards Agency sanctioned, I think it was Notting Hill Genesis last year for being too loose with the term home ownership. And I think that was fair enough. I mean, I guess the term, I think to first-time buyers who probably don't know an awful lot about the housing sector, the term shared ownership is really confusing, and they need an explanation of what it is. I think that you could go 2 ways with that. Either you can kind of disguise the negative elements and try and persuade people that it's a great option for them, or you can emphasise the things that are difficult about it, so that people come in with their eyes open. I think calling it an assured tenancy would kind of have the same problem as shared ownership, because I don't think anyone knows what that is. I think that you need to find a way of describing it that's kind of plain English. And I think when I talk to people about it, I tend to call it is part buy, part rent. And part buy because you are buying a leasehold, and part rent because you're renting it. Which, I mean, it's to me is always the most plain English way of talking about it. And I think it would help people grasp what they're dealing with a little bit better. But I think shared ownership is kind of clumsy for a lot of ways. I don't think it helps people understand it, and I do think it kind of obscures some of the more difficult parts.
Do you want to add anything more, Andrew, on that?
No, I think...
just on that point,
Well,
I mean, could be shared equity, couldn't it be called something else?
We got a lot of feedback when we had our session with people who had shared ownership, that some people were quite furious that they were describing it as ownership. And they felt, and some felt, not all, but some felt, that the product had been misrepresented by using that word. Do you understand the feelings of people in shared ownership when they come back and say, this is not really ownership?
I think that people, in my experience, the things that people are angriest about tend to relate to service charges, lease extensions, the difficulty selling.
I'm going to go on to talk about that, yeah.
I know we're going to hit those things, but I think those are the things that really need to be explained to people up front. I think a more kind of theoretical discussion about whether it is ownership or whether it is actually in law a leasehold matter less to people than whether or not they're going to get a huge bill for a lift replacement.
Well, I think it comes back to that other point that was just made about control, because people didn't feel, the ownership implies some sort of control, and they often didn't feel they were in control, not just for all sorts of reasons, and we could just move on to those, because the open mic session, they were very, very upset about the lease extensions and not knowing enough about lease extensions, not knowing enough about marriage value. And you've just, am I right, Pete Upps, you've got experience of shared ownership personally.
Yeah, I'm a shared owner, yeah. I bought a place in December last year. So I'm currently with a large London housing association. Me and my wife have a house. We had a lot of difficulty in the buying process for a previous place that we didn't actually end up getting around lease extensions, and it was incredibly difficult. It came even as a surprise to me as someone who knows more than the man on the street about the housing association sector, both how much it would cost and how inflexible paying for it was. We were asked to pay in order to get the property, because it was 82 years and the mortgage lender wanted it to be extended. We were asked to pay some in the region of £11,000, which we couldn't afford. And I think I don't understand how people can go into this owning a 99-year lease on a property, or in many cases a 125-year lease on the property, without being properly explained that you need to save now for the extension because it's going to cost an awful lot of money. It seems to come completely out of the blue. And there seems to be a kind of residual expectation in the sector, not just among housing associations, but among landlords of leaseholders, full stop, that people just have that money lying around to extend a lease, and people don't. I mean, it will make people bankrupt and they'll lose their homes. And I think it's a really difficult question. I also don't think it's particularly difficult to solve. I mean, some sort of payment plan. You're already paying monthly payments to the organisation. You could surely extend that over 3 or 4 or 5 years. But it just seems to be that at the moment the way we solve the issue of leasehold extensions is just to slap a bill on the person who is unfortunate enough to have bought a house without fully understanding what they were getting. And I mean, I don't think that's just going to create ill will. It genuinely ruins people's lives if they don't have the money necessary to pay it. So, yeah, I mean, in my experience, speaking to shared owners, in my experience with shared ownership, it's those kind of things where there's vast sums of money that you don't have, that you didn't expect to have to pay, that upset people, and the kind of more theoretical discussions, while issues of control and things like, for example, in my lease, I have to agree what colour I paint the walls with the landlord, and I'm not allowed to have pets and that sort of thing, and all those things are annoying, but they're nothing compared to an enormous invoice.
Chair, are there other questions coming up on this, or should we open it out to the panel?
Around the lease extensions and
Yes.
marriage value, yes,
Yeah.
I think it should
Open it up.
go open to the panel.
Is
yes.
there another question on it?
I don't think so. No.
So other members of the panel might have something to say about this.
There's a problem with leasehold generally. It's absolutely insane that we live in a society where, presumably through some hangover from feudal times, you can't actually fully own the place you live if you live in a block. I understand that it's inherently difficult if you have a block of flats, for example, and someone has to take control of the exterior of the building, of the structure of the building, of the land. But why don't we do it like every other country in the world, pretty much, and have a common hold system where the occupiers themselves club together and run the building and manage the building themselves. We're one of the only countries in the world that does this. It's not just shared ownership, it's leasehold generally. It's absolutely mad.
Well, our next investigation is going to be into that very issue of leasehold.
Great.
So yes, watch this space for that one.
Okay.
Oh, Alison. Yes.
Just a quick point on the issues about the legalities of marriage value and things like that. You might be talking about what information people get before they purchase, but one of the big things that came out of our study was that how little advice and guidance they receive from their solicitors. I think although it's sort of an empirical question, gone are the days where the solicitors will go through every clause and see what it might warn you of or what it might mean for the future. It's a bit more of an administrative process
Really?
to get the... Well, this is what people were saying. They didn't... There was things in the lease they evidently didn't understand, but the solicitors hadn't done an awful lot of work to explain all the different ins and outs of the lease. And we had a few people who were sort of unhappy about that. But yeah, just generally, the housing associations sometimes were a bit, not all, but a bit caveat emptor. They did give lots of information to people at the beginning of the sale, often though on a tick box, like 10-minute thing, going through explaining what the basics of shared ownership were, or again doing a tick box but in a shiny lovely kitchen where you're thinking you're a bit emotionally committed, thinking this could be mine, so not quite taking it in. But the landlords also presumed that the conveyancers were explaining all the ins and outs, where people got a very rudimentary service, and the panel of solicitors were chosen by the housing associations we worked with because of the speed with which they could complete on behalf from the provider's point of view rather than the purchaser's point of view. Because obviously, and the costs, well, I guess it's one of those things, you get what you pay for, and I think it would be an interesting area to look into as well.
I'd just briefly say that that's completely reflective of my experience. There was no explanation from the lawyers or the housing association of what a lease is and what it means and what the obligations are.
Goodness me.
Yes, not good.
So, Danny, did you just indicate?
I think that there's a clear, around lease extension, a clear gap of national guidance where greater standardisation of approach would be helpful. I think similarly to the previous question, if the mayor's using grant funding, potentially again to build that and this approach into the use of that grant funding where shared ownership is being built. I think what strikes me is around the debate around leasehold, around that nature of selling the dream that isn't quite true. There is this still obsession around this belief of this session around home ownership. But I think what comes back to often the core of the discussion is people are in desperate need of stability and security as fundamentals. And that's often expressed through home ownership or shared ownership. But there are other ways of offering people security, affordability for them and their families that aren't necessarily ownership or part ownership. And again, coming back to, you can offer housing. Other countries in Europe we've mentioned do offer longer term security through other forms, rented forms of accommodation. I do think we can't lose sight of that. And we're finding the demand is just as strong for that sort of product. Again, the Camden living, longer term tenancies, stable rents that are renewable. We've got our own list for that product, and close to 1,000 people have signed up who are eligible, who are interested in that housing. So there clearly is demand for stability of a different sort.
Can I just say, Danny, what you're talking about is a cultural shift. Are you marketing Are you using that language when you market?
The challenge we have is that we
Very interesting what
we
you're
can't market it too much because there isn't enough stock to meet demand. So we've got to say we've got close to 1,000 people in Camden who are interested, living and working in Camden who are interested. Our own pipeline, we've delivered 70 so far. We've got a pipeline of 300. We like to grow to 500, and obviously there's other sort of Section 6 gain as well. But you know, demand is exponential. Currently, the supply is not meeting that. So we haven't aggressively marketed the product in those terms. But I think clearly, you know, Londoners want stability and security and long-term, you know, particularly families, long-term security for them and their children where they're going to go to school. And again, that sometimes feels like shared ownership might be that way to get it. You've got more of a stake, but there's lots of problems that come with that model, we believe, and it isn't necessarily hitting the right people.
Yeah,
there are other ways.
Yeah, it was just the idea that you could market alternatives as giving the same, in fact, better.
Yeah, so the Camden Living model, we're really clear the things we do sell are longer term tenancies, stabilised rents, upfront, you know, fees and charges and service charges, which are all clear, all of those things that Londoners, I think, want.
I've got a couple of members wanting to come in. So Member Cooper first, and then...
I mean, I completely agree with you that it's important that conveyancing solicitors should give good information, but I do think if you're undertaking what will probably be the most expensive purchase that you will ever make during the course of your life, unless you buy a very expensive car, which would be the only other thing, that there is an element of people needing to take a lot of responsibility for looking into the small print and doing, you know, effectively going around and kicking all the tyres on the car, but, you know, in a property context. But the question I actually wanted to ask was really of Steve Mosley, and that's what length leases do you offer? Do you offer 999?
We're coming on to, I think.
Yes.
We're,
that's
that,
right.
Oh, that is actually your question
it is
further
my
down.
question.
But it's can we come back to that?
Well, we
when
could.
we get
It's
to
just that
your
we were
section.
talking about this right now, so I thought it was worth bringing it in because we were just talking about it. But I'm very happy to hold off and ask Stephen.
We'll come
If
back
you
to that
would prefer.
under your section, and I'll just bring in some Member Berry now because you indicated.
Yeah, just a couple of technical questions. Being a private renter myself, I've no idea about this home ownership business or what it involves. What are the structures of the payments to solicitors? Is it a flat fee and therefore you just get what you pay for, or is there a commission basis to that?
I'll respond. So we maintain a panel of solicitors, and so there is a flat fee around that. Our buyers are free to get advice from wherever they choose. We strongly recommend that they do get legal advice. The reason that we have the panel that we do is because they're all experienced in shared ownership, so they've been delivering in that area and they understand the lease. We also, I think a related point to that important to make is we use a model lease. So as part of the funding, the fact that this is publicly funded, there is a model lease that is provided by Homes England, GLA, that we all use. We are strongly recommended not to use anything else outside of that. It has fundamental clauses in there which have been agreed both with the government and with lenders, so we ensure that lenders, it's a product that they will lend on. And there has been I think a move over the past few years to continually look at that lease. There are a number of things that were in it before that have been removed from it and simplify it as much as possible. I think there's further work to do on that. But providing new shared ownership now today that is funded by the Mayor, that should all be on the basis of that model lease.
So if you wanted to find out more about it, you could find a detailed rundown of every part of that model lease as some kind of government guidance. You're not relying on your solicitors to do that.
There is a plain English explanation of it. Those leases are provided for houses, flats. They are publicly available. They're on Homes England's website. And as part of the process, we would normally expect our solicitors to give a kind of plain English run through of the buyer of what that means, what their responsibilities are. Clearly, what we've heard from others on the panel is a different experience about that, and plainly, if our panel solicitors were were acting in that way, and giving a sort of brief 5-minute run through, I'd be very disappointed.
Okay, and my second question is, do shared owners have the same rights to manage, right to transfer rights that you do for your blocks? In, say, a council block, if it's tenants and fully owned leaseholders, they have a...
That doesn't apply to housing associations. So
that's my question. Does it apply to shared ownership as a thing, or is it dependent on who the owner is, if you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It doesn't apply at all to housing associations.
I would be happy to come back to the committee with that. I don't know the answer on that.
Yeah, because that's possibly, I mean, you say, why don't we have things that are built as common hold, but you can seize it into common hold if you're a council tenant, can't you, essentially?
I worked with some, one of the housing associations that had been facilitating residents to take over the management and buy the freehold jointly of a block that was outside London. I think if it happens rarely, but they were quite alert to that the owners didn't have enough, didn't always have as much say over their blocks as other leaseholders, and if people came forward they would facilitate and broker with the freeholder to sort of exit their role and the freeholders, but I think it's probably quite rare.
And that was done through negotiation, not through having a right.
Yeah. But they exercise their right to manage, but they try. Well, they haven't got a right to manage, but they tried to broker it nevertheless. I had some other things to say about the savviness or otherwise of shared owners, if that's all right, because obviously, yes, it's a big purchase, and some people will look into it in huge detail, and but some people are more risk averse than others and are more savvy consumers than others. And financial inclusion literature says about there's a bit of a social gradient to people's understanding of like complex finances, products and things like that. And I think for a lot of and also that we learn to be good home buyers over a course of our lives, because it's something we buy jumpers every month or something, or clothes but we rarely buy a house, except only a few occasions in our lifetimes. And this is all sort of evidenced, and I know a few years ago Savage Javid was doing a thing about improving home buying experience, and part of that was about the information given to people, but it seems to be something that's dropped by the wayside with all the political turmoil and things. But I think what's interesting is that lots of buyers I've talked to about what information they've drawn upon and how they made the decisions to buy, whether in the open market and shared ownership, is they put a lot of some people put a lot of faith in what the professionals tell them, and will see. I don't understand mortgages. I left it all to the broker. I didn't understand that. The housing association gave me enough information, but of course, if you don't know some information, you don't know what wasn't told to you or explained at the time. And one thing I just wanted to flag up was the issue of home ownership, education and counselling. In the US, it's compulsory for assisted purchases, like they give help with down payments and cheaper loans and things for people to buy, and it's compulsory to go through home ownership education and counselling in 8 hours in a classroom or online, increasingly online, and there's a big demonstration project going on to see what the benefits are over time, but the evidence so far suggests people become better informed, improve their credit scores, because you get taught how to manage your finances, and you know who to go to if you get into trouble with your loan and mortgage and things. And I think for a whole range of sort of low cost home ownership products in the UK, there's some space where we could do something along those lines as well.
Thank you.
Just to check, Danny, Camden doesn't have any shared ownership that it directly provides at all, does it? Do you know if any councils do?
We have some legacy units from the beginning of our building programme before the intermediate housing policy came in. So there's a handful of shared, off the top of my head, I think probably like 5 to 7 units.
And do they have the same rights as other leaseholds.
I think potentially at Holly Lodge, actually, in Highgate, in your ward.
You did some shared ownership there.
I think so. It wasn't personal. So I think it was one of the early schemes. So
Okay.
there's some there.
And do you know if they have the say, if the tenants, because some of the blocks there have tried to do right to manage
Not to
them.
my knowledge, they have no. But I'm happy to provide
just
detail.
that clarification on that.
Do you want to take us into your next set of questions?
Is that me
Assembly
next?
Member Berry?
It's you. It's the first one on rent.
Yes. So yes, obviously, this is to Steve. I think he's the best person to explain this to us. When somebody buys, they've obviously paid their mortgage.
Yeah.
They're also paying rent on the part of the home they do not own. So how do you calculate that level of rent for somebody?
So again, this is stipulated within the funding guidance, so it can be a maximum of 2.75% of the value of that unowned share. It is increased by inflation annually, and if somebody's staircases, then it reduces down by the appropriate amount. There are occasions where the rent is lower. It cannot be higher than that level. There are occasions when it is lower, so particularly in respect of London, in some very high value areas, we'll see shared ownership rents that are lower than that to meet local affordability criteria set by the local authorities. So they can be down to 1%, but 2.75% is kind of the general standard.
And that's 2.75% per year.
Yes.
of the part of the home they don't own.
Yeah.
So if the average house in London is what, 500,000, then so three quarters of that, 400,000. 3 quarters of that's 300,000. So you're paying 2.75% of 300,000 pounds per year. So it's not a very high rent then. It's less. It's much less than a private rent.
No, it is subsidised, and the grant is a subsidy to keep that low.
So it's a few £100 a month on top of your mortgage that you have to pay.
Yeah, and I mean we're in a period where mortgage rates are incredibly low as well. So in the past, mortgage rates would be significantly higher than the rent, but it's been set at 2.75 for some time.
And that goes up, you said, by inflation?
Yeah.
Is that RPI?
RPI plus a half, I believe, 0.5%.
RPI plus a half?
Yeah, I believe so.
And that's by law that you can't go higher than that?
It's one of the things, I mean, one of the reasons we use a lease within shared ownership is to stipulate the things that we can and cannot do. So the rent and the rent proportion is specified within the lease. So we cannot alter that. So at the moment, at the time that it is bought, that cannot be altered. That is set within the lease.
And that doesn't go up with the increase in house values. It's the amount when you bought it is
when you bought it. Yeah.
Okay. And then the other thing that we've discussed is sort of fees for increasing your equity, your share, and all of those things. We've also heard about fees being charged for shared owners to make changes to their homes.
Yeah.
Is that something that L&Q does? And what justification can there be for that? That sounds a lot like, you know, the charges to make further copies of your lease when you're a private renter. You know, these doesn't sound very fair.
We do charge. We publish those charges on our website, so we charge for a range of things. I think that we have an in-house home ownership leasehold team that is responsible for dealing with any changes. So, you know, changes that people might make to their house could go from something very small to larger alterations. And so in those cases, we need to ensure that legally that is reflected, that they've got the right building permissions. We have an interest in the property, so we need to ensure that the security of that is maintained. So that's the reasoning behind it.
So it's an admin fee for your team to check that changes that are being made are okay.
Yeah.
So to what level of change does that descend to? Like, what's the least dramatic thing that you charge that fee for doing? If that makes sense.
I would have to come back to you.
Could you get a new kitchen, or no, you couldn't get a new kitchen without getting permission?
I wouldn't be able to confirm that. I'd have to come back to you on that.
And this sort of arrangement, is that covered in the standard lease? I mean, we could look up those rules of the changes you're allowed to make to your home.
Yep, that's all covered in the lease. Yep.
And so it defines the what you could change a window or a door or I mean, I'm just give me a general sense of what you can and can't do without paying a fee and getting permission.
So one of the reasons that we ask people to contact us is at the point that they staircase. If they made an improvement to their property, so let's take a kitchen. If they made an improvement to their property, then we will record it on our system, and at that point we will ask a valuer to discount it from the value of the property. So effectively, if that is improves the value of their property, they take that off at the point of staircasing, so that people aren't kind of being penalised from improving their own home, so they get the benefit of it. So that's one reason that we have to record it.
So it's because improvements count towards equity, as well as the fact that your team needs to check it's done properly.
Yeah.
So we are talking about more dramatic changes than replacing the doors or.
Yeah, I mean, they've
Still can't quite get a handle.
I mean,
on what
we heard.
What
So,
did
for
we
example,
hear in the
so Notting Hill Genesis, for example, charged 250 quid to get a letter saying that you can change your kitchen, which I just thought it seemed to us to be them getting money for nothing. Like, you know, if you're going to pick a kitchen out of the Magnet catalogue or whatever, it doesn't seem to require a letter from the housing association saying you did. I could possibly understand if you wanted to knock a wall through that the
or
freeholder
if it was the heating or electrical system, but yeah, if you're just installing
would need to do some
cupboards.
checks and make sure that you weren't destroying the fabric of the property. But if you're just installing a new kitchen, I wasn't quite clear why a £250 fee. I know this was Notting Hill, not you, but
and I know I don't know what our fees are on that. We have a range of fees that we charge. So you know, I'm happy to come back to you and provide what they are. But you know, the reason that we do it is we still have security of that property. We need to ensure that you know, certainly in terms of substantial changes, they're done in the right way. And I said, and there is a mechanism that if people wish to improve their properties, there is a mechanism where that is taken off at the point of staircasing, so they're not paying for it twice.
I mean, one of the things that we're all talking about at the moment is improving like the energy efficiency of homes, and there are lots of schemes where you might get given energy efficiency improvements for free, and if obviously you then have to pay a charge in order to get that, that's a disincentive to that kind of thing.
I would hope we would take a balanced view on that. I mean, certainly we're in the interest of covering our costs of having a team that is there available to answer leaseholder inquiries. We do not use it as a profit generating source of income. So that is certainly not our intention.
Okay, we'll look at that further. Pete, earlier you said you weren't allowed pets in a house. That seems excessive. Do you have any comment to make on the conditions that you've noticed being imposed on people and whether they're justified?
Well, I do. I you know, I think that I don't think it makes sense for that restriction to be in place. So it's a completely self-contained house. I also don't think that my landlord will find out if I bought my son a guinea pig. But you know, I think from talking to the people who were selling probably about that and speaking to my lawyers about it, it was something that was in the lease. They had a standard form lease, I think similar to Steve was talking about, and they applied it to a number of properties which cut across some where they didn't want pets and some where they did. And so rather than altering it, they just were handing everyone the same thing. I mean, it hasn't, I haven't bumped into any of those issues yet, but I've only been living in the house for a year. 5 or 10 years down the line, I might find that more frustrating. I haven't felt like the housing association is going to police it particularly officiously, unless I start doing things that are completely outrageous. So yeah, I mean, I think that if you're selling something as ownership, you should probably offer ownership, and that means as little control as you can possibly stomach. And that's certainly not the kind of black and white terms of my lease, although in terms of the actual experience of living there, it's been a little bit more like that. I did briefly just want to say something on Leonie's point earlier as well about the sort of caveat emptor point and whether or not shared owners should be just doing more research on this sort of thing. But I think you really do need to understand that by the nature of the product, you're almost exclusively dealing with first-time buyers who've got no experience of the property market and probably no knowledge of what leasehold is and what it entails. And I think people do really want to ask the right questions, but they don't know what questions to ask. And I think, I mean, I felt personally, even as someone who works within the sector, it would have been quite helpful if the GLA, as a kind of third party who aren't selling this product but are overseeing it, had published a list of things that you need to know before becoming a leaseholder or a shared owner, and were actively directing buyers to that, because the housing association people you deal with all the, and I'm not saying this is a criticism of them, but you are dealing with a sales team who have sales targets, and it's naive to expect them to tell you the kind of warts of a product that they want you to buy. You've probably also been hit by marketing, some of it from organisations describing this stuff as ownership, and so it takes quite a I don't know why you'd go in and say, oh, is it really ownership? And I think that there's a real space there for just some public body to step in and say, here's a list of 10 things you need to know about leasehold, and if you're comfortable with it, then go for it. If you're not, then maybe this product's not for you. But just expecting people who are first-time buyers whose parents don't necessarily own their own homes either to work all this stuff out for themselves is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah,
It wasn't quite what I was saying, but I'll come. I'm going to ask some questions in a minute.
We'll come. Yeah, we'll come.
I was just going to open up.
Okay, and I'll bring in Assembly Member Gavron after you.
Thank you for that, Peter. And it does seem like obvious that if we're funding it from the GLA, we should be providing the right amount of information. But just on the question of changes to the homes, I just wondered if Alison or Ruben had anything to add about the conditions that are put on people's activities within the home. And
makes complete sense that a housing provider that has a long-term interest in the asset will want to be notified and give permission in cases where it's a structural change. It doesn't make sense to me that the leaseholder has to pay for that. And again, this is a leasehold problem. This is not a shared ownership problem. If you're a full owner in a leasehold flat, you face exactly the same charges, which, by the way, are levied on you even if the landlord says no. So it's not a shared ownership problem, it's a leasehold problem. It's just, as you say, Sian, it's exactly like tenancy fees for photocopying and the rest. I think housing associations could probably easily absorb that themselves. I'd also go even further than Pete on pets. I think pets should be allowed everywhere. It makes no sense to me that in the private sector, even private rented sector, that you're not allowed to do what you want with your home as long as it's not affecting the built product.
I think that's a good point, that because the housing association has the long-term interest in the property, it's kind of their job to keep an eye on it and not just charge everything to the shared owner. I think that's a really good point. Alison?
Yeah, the only issue with that is that I talked to lots of people who had bought their shared ownership home 10, 20 years ago who said that the housing association took no interest whatsoever in the state of the home, and they had a few of them had serious disrepair, and they'd bought these homes through the DISO scheme from the days of yore, where you could buy it off the open market, and then bought them as resales and things. But these properties did have disrepair, and which also affects the value of the property. But that's where they became frustrated with the shared epithet, because nothing was shared. But as for with the issue of permissions and fees, I have talked to people who've had permission to see, but much lower, £25 to put up a shed in the garden and things like this, which seems to be taking the bureaucracy slightly far. Well, that's not to say that's across the board. I think one thing to underline here is that the housing association practices will probably vary quite a lot. Not all, as Steve said, I think that's a good way to approach improvements that the purchasers have done, that you discount that from the final valuation if they were staircasing or selling, but not all housing associations do that. So some might take if you put in a £10,000 kitchen, they'd still split that and they'd benefit from if it increased the value by 10,000, they'd still take whatever the proportion was of that uplift. So I think there's a lot of variety of practice.
We're trying to find out a bit more about that, but
Yeah. Just, I'm glad you've raised pets, Assembly Member Berry.
a bit of an obsession of mine.
Battersea Cats and Dogs Home have a great campaign on pet-friendly properties and responsible pet ownership. Steve, do you know if L&Q has signed up to Battersea's campaign?
I'm afraid I don't know.
Right, okay. Well, if not, it's a great thing to sign up to.
I'll look into it.
Yes,
pets are very good for mental health. Assembly Member Gavron, you wanted to come in.
I just wanted on the home improvement side, just wanted to ask if, well, just to put that there is a case, I think, for possibly, I need to be reassured whether there is a case for charging if what the home improvement leads to is an inspection. And we've heard a lot because of Grenfell and Lacanau and so on about leaseholders being involved in structural improvements, which mean changes of doors, they don't become fire doors, breaking the firewall and so on through certain structural improvements, changing the insulation. And I just wonder what comments you might make about that, because there should be some kind of inspection.
No, the question is who pays.
So who's going to answer? Is there inspection, and do you charge for it?
I mean, if I
think I ask L&Q this.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of fire regulations, we have leaseholder properties with cladding on at the moment, and we are removing that. We are not charging that to the leaseholders. We are the building owner, and so therefore it is our responsibility to ensure that is safe. So in terms of cladding, we are not passing on any of those costs to our leaseholders.
I'm talking about inside, actually. Firewalls, all sorts of home improvements inside can lead to fire issues.
Yeah, and so I think if there is, we have the responsibility for carrying out fire risk assessments. I'm not aware that we are charging on the costs of those fire remediations to our leaseholders.
Okay, just something, when we come to leaseholders, we might look at that.
Okay, we'll move on to our next section now, and that's being led by Assembly Member Cooper.
Yes, but just before I come into that, I didn't bother to indicate, but just on the business of charging money to leaseholders or shared owners for making changes, and Assembly Member Gavron has just touched on it. I may be the only person in the room who's managed large numbers of properties, tenanted, leasehold and all the rest of it. But if you're going to charge £250, it's probably because you need to get a surveyor to come round and have a look. And with the best will in the world, I understand about just changing kitchen cupboards, but there have been plentiful examples in the past, particularly when mortgage rates have been higher, when people have done things like removed, Neff ovens and expensive kitchen equipment and have then ended up with a kitchen that has been, this may not be so common at the moment because mortgage rates are so low. So that's why a lot of landlords will reserve the right to come around and conduct an inspection, because the state of a beautiful kitchen, or even downgrading from something that's high quality to a magnet kitchen, or other brands are available, but people have just removed them, and have then sold them because they've got into trouble with paying their mortgage. So there've been examples of that, and I think a £250 charge for a surveyor to come round to make sure that the ducting that you're putting in is not breaching the fire regulations. Kitchens are not just cupboards, they include electrics, water, a lot of other things go on in kitchens, and I think that's where it has originally come from, because shared ownership has been around since 1979. It's not something that landed last week. So I think that's where now if someone's charging £250 and all they do is send out a letter and they don't bother to do the inspection, then I think the person who's being charged in that way has a pretty good argument for arguing against it. Anyway, that I just wanted to say that, but just to come back to the point about having and just on pets, actually, I think not having poisonous pets or pets that cause annoyance to neighbours. I may also be the only person who's managed properties outside of London where we had clauses where you couldn't own ponies or pigs because there were large green spaces outside people's properties. I was working in Hastings, and I believe that, you know, people wanted to put lots of ponies and horses, and also poisonous pets. I'm very much in favour of pets that don't interfere with the peace and quiet of adjoining neighbours, but there have been lots of examples of people with snakes, for example, that have then escaped from one flat and got into another flat. It's unpopular with people's neighbours to wake up and find that they're being squeezed by an anaconda. I can't think why, can you? So I'm going to stop
Quite
talking
extreme
about
examples there. I mean, I was thinking more getting a cat. But, you know.
I'm very fond of cats and dogs, and I think anyone who wants a cat or dog or anything else that's that can't escape through tubes into somebody else's house and do that sort of thing. You know, we've just had a whole load of baby pythons in Battersea Park, for example, not far from Battersea Cats and Dogs Home, and it was clearly someone whose python was producing new pythons, and they had to get rid of them somewhere. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I don't know that they were a tenant, or indeed a leaseholder or a shared owner. Just coming back to the issue of the length of leases, do you think it would be fair, and I start with Steve Mosley, to say that they should be a minimum of 125 years, and also to make it much more explicit about the costs that might be involved in people extending them? How long are the leases that you offer?
We offer 125-year leases as standard.
That's your standard.
The funding guidance requires a minimum of 99, but we as a...
When you say your funding guidance, you mean from your lenders who are putting...
No, from Homes England GLA. So the standing
GLA.
funding guidance to receive grant says that it can't be less than 99 years. But we grant 125 years because that is generally, if you are buying a leasehold property on the private market, that's what would be granted, so we follow that.
Could you offer more? Could you go for 999 or 250 or?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. In some cases, we are restricted because we are not the freeholder, and so that depends on what we can offer. I know it is a point of concern, and I think it's something that we've got to take seriously. If there was a move to raise the minimum level, then I think we'd be supportive of that. We're certainly not in the position of wishing to generate any income out of lease extensions and to see them run down. So on the basis that we want it to be as long as possible, we have no business stream out of this at all. So if we could, I would welcome longer leases.
But Peter definitely referred to the idea that, you know, it might cost £10,000 or £11,000 to extend a lease. I mean, that seems very onerous to me, and I can see Peter is nodding. I mean, not everybody has, you know, £10,000 or £11,000 lying around at home.
No,
in fact, most people probably don't. Let's face it.
I agree. I mean, the number of lease extensions that we've had within our shared ownership portfolio is very, very small. So 17 last year out of a portfolio of 9,000 homes. We are actively contacting some of our other leaseholders where we think they're getting to the 80-year limit and advising them to extend before that. So, as I said, we have responded to Competition Markets Authority inquiry on this and made it really clear this is not our business. We are interested in people accessing home ownership, not from generating income out of the leases. So where we have to charge it as a result of an extension, then we have to do that. But longer leases, I have absolutely no issue with.
So you seem to be being pretty clear that L&Q doesn't see charging for extensions as a sort of income business stream, and that you're keen to get people to extend, because obviously once you get below a certain number of years, it's up. Quite hard to remortgage or sell.
Yes.
In fact.
Yes.
Do you know if that's the same? I don't know. Is it the G1, G2, G3, G15?
G15.
It's still the G15, even though
it's still the G15, although there's less of us.
There's only 6
the
members
G15.
now. Yes.
I don't know. I don't know their policy on it.
So it's not something that's been discussed there, or you just don't know if it's...
No, it's not.
Perhaps we could find out whether it's something that the G15, because obviously a lot of the Mayor's funding has been allocated to G15 members, and it strikes me that you know, having a G15 policy as well as a Homes England and a GLA policy on extending leases, and then we actually get round this need for having a discussion about is 10,000, 5,000 or twopence halfpenny a good amount for doing the extensions.
I agree, and you know it is a bit of an anomaly as well that the model lease says minimum 99. So I mean that would be an easy thing if we're offering greater than that level as a standard, then it should at least catch up with that.
I'm not going to ask about all the ins and outs of what L&Q does in terms of making sure that shared owners are well informed, because I think we've actually explored that area, and we've also talked about the fact that you have a panel of solicitors, but people are also free to select their own solicitors should they so wish. Do you happen to know that is common to the rest of the G15 as well?
Yes.
So everybody would say, here's a panel of...
You can't compel, I don't think anybody would compel to use a particular solicitor. We encourage, because we have solicitor experience with shared ownership, and it goes back to the point that if somebody doesn't understand that or think it's a normal lease and doesn't understand the variances around it, that they might not get the best advice.
So presumably the people on your panel, coming back to the point about what do people know about part by part rent, it's quite a complicated first tenure, but it must also be a slightly more complicated thing for a conveyancing solicitor. So that presumably the people on your panel are people who know the ins and outs and are in a better position to be able to advise people. So is that a point that you make to people when they're selecting who they might ask for their conveyancing advice?
Yeah, well, I mean, we publish the panel. We make it very clear why we've chosen them, that they've got a long history in shared ownership, that they understand it, but not to the extent that we would say that you have to use these. We've also made it clear that we've selected them because we have negotiated, because of the volume of work that they do with us, they deliver lower fees, and so we are transparent around what those fees will be.
So what percentage of the people who are part buying, part renting from L&Q would use the solicitors from the L&Q panel?
I couldn't give you the exact percentage, but it's very high. Most
very high. Would you be able to write to us afterwards and give us that figure? So I thought that might be the case, particularly obviously if there's a sort of cost thing. And we've talked about the are people told when they're purchasing their share about the implications of should they ever need to extend? Are they given all of this information right at the beginning? Yeah. Okay. On the issue of service charges, which we've sort of touched on a tiny bit, shared owners, although they're part buying and part renting, are responsible, even though they don't have 100% rental, for 100% of the service charges. Do you think that's fair?
So the service charges, for a start, they are regulated. We are charging back services that the shared owners are receiving, and on that basis I think it is fair that they pay the whole amount. If you were a private rented tenant in that block, you would also be charged back the full amount of the services included in your gross rent, because you are receiving them. So we are charging back what people are owning. The fact that they've got a mortgage on 25% does not mean that they're not receiving the full services from that. So in terms of a position, I think it's fair. We clearly have a challenge to try and keep service charges as low as we possibly can. There are regulations about what we can and cannot charge for, and so
I think you're crossing back into the point that I think Reuben has made quite eloquently throughout, that in some senses part by part rent is the arrangements are not that different from people who are a full leasehold purchaser of a flat in a block. They would all those people, even though all they're doing is buying and not renting anything, they would be picking up all of the service charges for that block between them. So in that sense, the fact that there's a bit of buy as well as a bit of renting is neither here nor there.
Absolutely. It's consistent with other leasehold tenure.
Whether that's generally fair for either type of tenure is an entirely separate point. In line with the Mayor's shared ownership charter for service charges, are you taking steps to review your service charges on a regular basis to ensure that ongoing costs are minimised and possibly even reduced? You said you'd like to keep them to a minimum. Obviously, it is a very regulated area.
Yeah.
Have you been able to reduce at all?
In some cases we have, yes. So this through procurement, we are always trying to ensure that the services that we can deliver as cheaply as we possibly can. Those service charge accounts are scrutinised, they are signed off by our auditors to show that they are effective in a true record. As I said, they're covered by legislation in terms of what we can charge as well. I think it's fair to say that particularly in London, where we have had, if you think about some of the mechanical and electrical equipment we have, combined heat and power, certainly the costs around those have created high service charges in case and some schemes. We are trying as much as possible to actively design out those charges, so we won't put in facilities for the sake of it. And I think Pete raised an important point about things like concierges and get put in. I'll give you an example of, say, around gyms. We never put things like that as standard to our service charge, because we think that should be a choice for our shared owners to pay. So it's always our position that we will try and keep it as low as possible, that we won't throw in those extra services, and that if there is a choice of something they want to join a gym, then they've got the opportunity to do that, but we wouldn't bake it into the service charge.
I mean, you'll obviously be writing out to people with the estimated service charges once a year, and then you'll be writing it out to them subsequently to say these are the actual costs that we incurred, and then doing that sort of balancing exercise between them. When you write out to people about the service charges, either estimated or actual figures, are you also encouraging them to take out contents insurance, and because they're also part buying buildings insurance as well? Because I'm aware that there is an issue of under-insurance in amongst a lot of housing association tenants, and it's very important, I think, if you're part purchasing as well as part renting. I mean, it's important for everybody, obviously. Yeah. Is that something that you're regularly encouraging people to do?
I don't know whether we're regularly encouraging it. I know that we make a particular point of it, the point of purchase, making clear that we are responsible for the building's insurance and that's charged back, but they need to arrange their own contents insurance. So it is displayed within all our literature. Whether we follow that up through the service charges, I don't know.
So you wouldn't be able to tell us what percentage of your shared owners might have proper insurance arrangements in place?
I wouldn't know.
Is that something that you've ever been noticed that you've been encouraged to do, Peter? And are you aware that others are encouraged to get their property and its contents insured?
That did happen, yeah. It came from the mortgage broker, who
I believe
would have also secured commission on the insurance. So. But
whether it is still worth taking out insurance.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you obviously don't have to take it out from the person that
No, of course not. No. Yeah. But it was mentioned, and we were encouraged to do that. But yeah, it was the broker.
Because I think insurance is obviously something that should be encouraged as much as possible. And I think that's the end of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a question now for Alison, actually, about the recommendations that you made back in 2015 about reforming shared ownership, particularly around making marketing material more explicit, that full ownership might be unattainable for some people, increasing data collection on shared ownership, including what type of housing tenure people move into when they leave shared ownership. Have there been any changes on these issues since you made these recommendations?
Sorry, I was just reminding myself of what they are as well. I think in terms of marketing, I think just yesterday the National Housing Federation made a whole new thing about sales and marketing literature, about explaining that you don't share with a person, with a friend, it's shared between the housing association and the purchaser and things. I think again, it's all about sales and marketing. I think there's an awful lot of effort goes into sales and marketing without the boring explanations of all the different things you have to think about if you're purchasing from an independent point of view. I do sense there's been a bit of a change in marketing about literally shared ownership and moving towards the part rent, part buy. But it's a very live issue between housing associations. I've been in focus groups with providers who are saying they debate it endlessly, and people saying it's not shared and it's not owned, but then they're saying people know, a lot of people still do know what that product is, so they don't, it's nervous of having been through a whole different heaps of low-cost home ownership rebrandings and things. People are a bit nervous to move away from that. In terms of the other, so I sense there's some change, but not in terms of the detail is the upshot of that. In terms of social businesses, this is one of the recommendations. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's because I've done work since this report, but it was again on accessing how people outside, so I can't comment whether that's particularly changed or not. Conveyancing, I've mentioned already. Leasehold reform, we've talked about. Lender provider communication. Yes, I think there is an issue. I'm bidding for some work at the moment about looking at whether shared ownership products are a safer way to enter ownership than the open market for low to moderate income households, because I think this was quite interesting about the variety of ways that arrears and possessions are managed. There was instances of lenders just wanting wanting what they if it was repossessed, wanting to execute the mortgage protection clause and get claw money back from any losses back from the housing association, which would then be put on the account of the purchaser, but without much challenge. And I think some of the challenges that one of the associations offered to lenders there was it was in the favour of the purchasers, and I think that seemed like quite good practice. But I think there was issues as well about capitalising rent arrears, because housing associations routinely wrote to the lenders to pay off any rent arrears, but then that's increasing their debt with interest at the lender, and I suspect that might need re-looking at again with lenders of they may not be in the best interests of the tenant. They're effectively borrowing that money to repay the housing association. So I think looking a bit more at that issue would be beneficial, but it hasn't come out in enough detail from the studies I've done so far. And staircasing, we've already talked about third-party managing agents. I talked about with the problems with the head lease, that you might still staircase to 100% and still not have managing member rights over the management company and things like that if the housing association isn't a freehold and things. I'm not sure what I'm going on a bit, but I think we've sort of talked about some of the other things.
Fine.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And we'll move now into the last set of questions, which is Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chair. What impact would the government's proposals to reduce the initial stake required from 25% down to 10% have on shared owners? And anybody can start.
I think one of the interesting points on this for me is kind of relating back to what Danny was saying earlier about potentially offering living rent type models with long-term security of tenure. Because, I mean, for us, the only reason we were looking at shared ownership was because me and my wife were becoming parents, and the only way we could find a property in London that would get us through, we know we'd be living there throughout my son's primary school, was shared ownership. It was the only option. I think once you get down to 10% ownership, you are offering that security, and that's something that people will want, but surely there's other ways of offering that security. And I'm not sure that getting the 10% is the thing that I think you would get a lot of appetite for it, but I think the people that would be coming would be people who want security, not people who want 10% of a home. And so in kind of designing housing schemes, I think you could easily offer that and think it was a roaring success because you had people queuing around the block for it. But I think you probably need to be asking yourself the question, why were they queuing? And I think it's because it is the only option in London to live in an area for a long period of time.
I think that's absolutely right. And luckily, government's committed to ending Section 21 now, and we might see the need for shared ownership to be more accessible drop even more, hopefully, if that eventually happens.
Anybody else?
I mean, I support what both Pete and Ruben have said. 25% is instinctively felt to me like the right level, particularly the discussion we've just had around service charges. I think when you get down to 10%, there is a question about whether you are helping marginal households into home ownership. I would prefer that if this was about making it more affordable, that focus was around the cost of the rent and maybe sort of grant going into that to reduce the overall costs rather than an ever lower level. So I don't know what the magic level is that it looks and feels like ownership, but 10% feels low to me.
Thank you. And what impact might the government's proposals...
Sorry, Alison wants to come in.
Sorry.
Tony.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment as well to reflect what people have said, but 10%, you're trading 10% equity share, which wouldn't be 10% equity share, would be 5% of 10% if you've put in down a 5% deposit for repairing responsibilities and upkeep and insurances and all the rest of it. And again, I think you'd be drawing in, the danger is drawing in people for whom it's not the best place to be. And not the best tenure, and that there are other arrangements, if people have said that might meet their needs better. So I think that's an important thing. But I think there's also an important point in London that across the country, the shares that people buy in shared ownership, you'd think London is the most expensive place, would mean people are buying lower shares, but that isn't necessarily the case. So, because we talked about people being on higher incomes and things. So,
okay, thank you. What impact might the government proposal to allow people to staircase in 1% increments rather than the current 10% increments have on shared ownership, do you think? Again, anybody could start.
To fix that, you'd first have to fix the transaction costs part of it, because if you're paying many hundreds, if not thousands of pounds to just go out of bed and staircase at all, staircasing increments of about 1% just doesn't make sense. As we talked about earlier, most people staircase, when they do staircase, straight to 100% if ever they do. So I don't really see the benefit of it at all.
Anybody else?
I own 55% of the home. I would feel absolutely no different about my life in any way if I own 56%. I can't see the benefit myself.
Okay, I think that's unanimous. The government is looking to reform the leaseholder system, but not for shared owners. Does the leasehold element of shared ownership need reform in your opinion? And if so, what alternate arrangement would you suggest? Go on, Steve, you can start this time.
So, I mean, my view around leasehold and shared ownership is that it's an effective way to deliver this product. It's far more effective and flexible than other home ownership approaches that use equity loans. The lease in itself enables the fact that you can staircase up throughout, which isn't the same where you have an equity charge on the property. So I think as a construct, it is effective and it does what it needs to. We don't maintain a lease when we don't need to. So if it is a house, the moment that a shared owner staircases, then the lease extinguishes and they get the freehold. So we are using it purely on the basis to enable that transaction to happen. It's been around for 35 plus years. We've been delivering it since 1985. I think the lenders like it. It is now, and it certainly wasn't the case in the early days of shared ownership, that all of the major high street lenders support it. There is a good range of mortgages to that. So as a product, it is the only intermediate product that has lasted throughout that entire period. Many have sort of come and gone, but shared ownership has been the constant through that period, which kind of suggests to me that there is something right about it. Within our property system, leasehold as a way to manage it is effective. I think leasehold has clearly been damaged by some of the sharp practices that we've seen over the past few years, particularly say around leasehold houses. I think we've got to continue to drive down service charges. I don't think where people are being in a position where leases are allowed to run down and they're then getting large charges to extend the lease. All of that kind of does damage to it, but all of those things I would define as sharp practice. And so if it's delivered in a responsible way, I think it's an effective way to deliver this product.
Everybody else agree? Looks like
So, I mean, we build a mixed tenure, including private sale of leasehold, the shared ownership beyond that arrangement too, the very small amount that we have delivered. I think there's clearly scope for a national conversation about leasehold. Generally, the general challenges apply across both shared ownership and full ownership. So I think there was a lot of discussion pre-election around common hold as an alternative form. That was something we actively looked at. I think from a sales perspective, it's probably a net positive to move to a common hold arrangement. You're probably going to be a more sellable product than a leasehold product from a market perspective. But I think there are some practical challenges, particularly for public builders. If you're seeking to deliver mixed communities, if you're seeking to deliver mixed tenure blocks, there are some challenges potentially of moving from a leasehold arrangement for intermediate and private sale to a common hold arrangement when you potentially have social tenants living within that block too. So there are some practical challenges. How you, for example, deliver shared services like combined heat and power facilities to blocks of different tenure arrangements. So there are some practical issues I think that does merit a lot of discussion. But clearly I think, coming back to Steve's point, there's some fundamental bad practices that need to be stamped out regardless of how the model evolves. I think that should be the first focus.
May I just come in specifically on that? Is there a danger, if you don't mind, is there a danger that we're moving to, if we were to move to common hold, therefore that we'd have more rich doors and poor doors?
I think there's a challenge in how the model currently is proposed, yes. I think for builders such as us, we build tenure blind. We're very proud about that. It's embedded in our planning policies. And I think it would present a management challenge to develop blocks in that way. There potentially is other ways around that, and I think we're open for conversation, but I think that would be our reluctance at this point. Certainly from a sales perspective of the private sale units, there isn't a challenge. I think we think it'd be net positive, but I think it's more on the management side. There is an issue.
Thank you.
Tony?
If I can just sneak in, as the Chair hasn't mentioned this himself, I just thought this is a question that I'd been suggested to me. How would the Mayor's proposed rent controls affect the operation and viability of shared ownership in your views?
I think that would depend on the wording of the law or whatever. I mean, so shared ownership rents are capped at RPI plus 5% a year. If that happens to be over whatever the Mayor's cap on increases would be, I don't know, it's a matter for whatever.
It's a different form of tenure, so presumably it's have a different arrangement.
It would apply.
Yeah, that's
yeah. I mean, in a sense, so just to jump in, we have rent capping on social tenants. We have rent capping in this tenure. We don't for private rented sector tenures, often where there's a significant amount of public subsidy to the housing benefit system propping it up. So I think for coming back to the core challenge for Londoners, which is they want a stable, affordable home that gives them security, I think better rent reform in the private rented sector is a must. And actually is what Londoners need. And I think, again, it drives back this sort of obsession for security through ownership and shared ownership, because in the private rented sector, which is now in Camden the biggest sector, that there isn't that security and stability there.
Also on that point, there are specific places and markets already where, because of the subsidised rent that you pay on a shared ownership home and the RPI plus 0.5% increase, there are times when that's more expensive than a market rent for the portion you don't own. And if, of course, you're bringing private rents down, that might exacerbate that problem, and it might make shared ownership less popular or harder to sell for the people living in it, maybe.
Thank you. And my final question, more generally, does anyone have a comment on what effective alternatives there could be to the shared ownership model that would assist people on low and medium incomes into home ownerships that we haven't already discussed this morning?
Yes, the way to make home ownership affordable is to make home ownership affordable for everyone by building enough homes, by reforming our broken property tax system, by making the private rented sector better, by bringing housing costs down for everyone. Shared ownership is great, but it's a symptom of the problem, and it's not a solution for everyone. We need policies from government, regional and national, that will get enough homes built to bring housing costs down and make housing affordable for everyone.
The Mayor's listening. Peter, you got any comment? Last comments?
I think that what London needs is many more social rented homes, only managed by housing associations and councils, and the chronic problems in London's housing market will only be solved when we have that. Shared ownership isn't the answer to the people at the very sharpest end of this problem. Is never going to be. I'd briefly say on your previous question about leasehold, just one point I did want to make on that is that the characteristics of a shared ownership buyer are that they're typically younger, probably more naive about the property market, have less money, and maybe a more kind of immediate or a sharp housing need. And I think all of those things make them more vulnerable to the problems with leasehold, like high service charges and lease extensions, because they might not have known the right questions to ask, and they won't have the money to deal with the problems when they come along. So I don't think it's a question of is leasehold a worse model for shared ownership than it is for home ownership, but the people who get shared ownership are less well prepared to deal with the pitfalls of leasehold.
Alison?
Yeah, I just want to say about looking at homes as homes rather than assets, and things that, and as Ruben said about shared ownership as a sort of response and a symptom rather than the issue in itself, because it's about like stocking housing being such a sort of financial asset, making sure land's protected from all these market fluctuations and can be offer homes in perpetuity that are affordable. And I was interested in the sort of community-led housing and CLTs and things, but exploring ways of how those things can be delivered at scale to make things permanent. And as Daniel said about if people do staircase, then even though they're recycled, it might buy less than what it's already got sold, if you see what I mean. So I think looking at sort of out-of-the-box things like that, but at scale, might be of interest, but I haven't got evidence on it.
Final word?
Shared ownership isn't the only solution, it's part of it. I think we need more housing of all types. My view is it is absolutely the most effective intermediate housing option. Help to Buy does not work in London. There have been many schemes that say they've come before shared ownership, and it continues to deliver for an important part of the market. The opening remarks were around, it's really clear, we've got to be really clear who we're trying to help, and I think as long as we're clear about that and provide more housing of all tenures, then I would prefer to focus on reforming shared ownership, improving the buyer experience, but using that as the main intermediate product.
Thank you. Chair.
Member Berry actually wanted to come in. Thank you, Tony.
Yes, I just wondered if Alison could outline a bit more about the kind of models that CLTs use, essentially. And also somebody brought up earlier shared equity. I think Nikki mentioned it, which is a different product again. It's what a lot of regeneration projects are ending up offering shared equity to existing leaseholders as an alternative to shared ownership, because they've resisted shared ownership. And I just wondered, I think, Alison, you're probably the best person to outline both what shared equity is, i.e. with the lack of obligations that there are on somebody who has a shared equity deal, and the way that relates to what CLTs tend to offer, which is essentially where the CLT or the co-op owns you buy only a proportion of the value of a home, and you can't profit from it.
Where you could buy, if a CLT, you may own well, there's different models and they've all been constituted sort of slightly differently, and CLTs and shared equity isn't what my area of expertise, so I haven't actually done lots of work on them, but I think the shared equity meet people more secure in their position as a homeowner, but as people of the home buy options or help to buy as it is now, hasn't necessarily been meeting the same target group that shared ownership has been dealing with. People are at a higher price point and in terms of income, but also of purchase. But people feel more confident that it's a simpler model, that you don't feel like you've got the breadth of the housing association on you. If some people feel like that, not all. But with CLTs, I know Tom Moore from Liverpool University has done a lot of work in them and shown some of the potential, but I think that's where the land value is split from the housing value. Some of the houses may be owned individually, but some may be, but some of it's at a proportion of your local incomes, so like a multiple of local incomes, so they try and keep them affordable in perpetuity, and the land's held for public good, so it doesn't get sold on or doesn't get regenerated away from affordable housing, as it were. I don't, it's not my area, but I just think they show potential, but the problem with them at the moment is that they're all quite small niche enterprises, and I'm interested in the sort of mutual models, how they could be scaled up. I think that's worth investigating, but I haven't done the work. So
potentially a can of worms. Can anyone tell us more about the shared equity options that are being offered to existing leaseholders?
We use the shared equity model, as you've mentioned, Sean, on our existing regeneration schemes, so particularly where leaseholders, it's an option for leaseholders to move into the new estate or decant into the new buildings if it's a phased development, and that's possible. The new value of the properties would be such that they, you know, on a traditional outright purchase, they're unlikely to be able to necessarily staircase, if you will, to that full model. So as a way of supporting leaseholders to stay on the estate, we offer a shared equity approach. They don't pay rent on the non-owned element, and they'll just pay a usual service charge that the leaseholder would pay.
They're in the, I mean, is it freehold?
No, it's a leasehold arrangement still.
Still leasehold?
Yeah. But I think, talk about slightly different models. I think coming back to the previous question, you know, how do we make this work? I think what I've tried to present, I think particularly in inner London, and I think increasingly across London, it isn't working. Lowering the amount you can buy to start off with to 10%, maybe you can increment by 1%, that's not going to make the system work. That's dealing with the symptoms of the problem. And I think fundamentally, you know, the other side of the coin is we're trying to make, you know, sale properties smaller and smaller as a way to make them affordable. It's quite clear, I think, as Peter mentioned, we need to build a lot more homes. We need to build a lot more genuinely affordable homes. That isn't necessarily ownership. We need to provide people with stability and security. And I think one thing the GLA could do is look again at the grant system, because it doesn't incentivise things like Camden Living Rent or Living Rent products. We need a blended, sort of gradualised, incremental grant system that rewards affordability and also awards larger family units as well.
Yeah.
Previously, we've discussed the grant system with housing associations, and they've said much the same thing.
Yeah.
Also, that they are fixed per unit size, so you end up with lots of smaller units.
Yeah. Of course, one of the problems is the government do specify that living rent has to lead to ownership, which is a problem with the
government
conditions that the government attaches.
Restrictions, not GLA
Yes.
restrictions, aren't they? On the way that the whole of the package of funds that comes to the mayor has to be structured in that way.
But not the grant.
Anyway, we're falling into about. Sorry, had you finished something then?
I had, I just wanted to get a bit more out about these other sort of own it but don't
very
have
helpful.
the ongoing obligations.
Thank you.
Of things.
Okay, well, in that case, I think we've reached the end of the session. Can I thank our guests for your contribution today? We have a few more formal items on the agenda which we need to discuss, which you're welcome to stay for or you're welcome to escape now. So, finally, can I ask the committee to note the report as background to put in questions to the invited guests on affordable home ownership, the subsequent discussion,
and the informal Housing Committee meeting held on the 4th of November 2019 as background to the investigation. Thank you. Can I also ask the committee to agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any outputs from the discussion?
Agreed.
Thank you. Work programme. Can I ask the committee to note the Housing Committee work programme and note the topics for the committee's meeting in February and March 2020 as agreed at the GLA Oversight Committee on the 17th of December 2019?
Yes.
Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for 11th February at 10 o'clock in here, the chamber. There's no other urgent business, so that concludes the meeting. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Right, so let's